This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Hi, I'm Li Xueying, and you're listening to Asian Insider. In this episode, ST's Aqil Hamzah talks about the creative ways in which Indonesia's informal workers deliver services to customers' doorsteps. Good to have you on the show, Aqil.
Hi, hello.
Hello. So, Aqil, I was really intrigued by the story that you wrote recently about Indonesia's service providers on wheels, or what the locals call jasa keliling. I hope I got that correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So these are folks not just the ones that deliver goods or food, but they actually deliver services ranging from massages to ironing. I feel like I can do with that right now. Can you tell me a bit more about this?
Yeah, so when I came to Jakarta for the first time in August, I think it was a bit of a culture shock to see so many motorcycles and bicycles just peddling different things. So for instance, I guess food vendors are very common in other parts of Southeast Asia. So those were relatively normal for me. But the ones that really got my attention were those that had tons of instant beverage sachets, for example. And then after that, when doing research for this story, I found out that in remote parts of Indonesia where things like banks may not be as commonplace, things like ATMs, or else even trying to get to a phone shop to change a SIM card may not be as accessible. There's people who actually go around house to house, either on motorcycles or bicycles, and they actually offer those services. So you can actually get money loaned to you from these people, or else if you want to change your SIM card.
Banks on wheels, ATM machines on
yes,
wheels.
But I don't think they're affiliated with the banks though. And I was reading some local articles that people basically said they're pretty much loan sharks if you think about it. So I guess it does give rise to this whole idea that, all these people, their own entrepreneurs, and it's really just a part of the informal sector where they're not tied to a particular brand or a particular company, and they're just doing these to make ends meet, basically.
I see. So what were some of the services that you yourself have tried? So I know in the article you wrote about, for instance, this traveling tailor, right, Mr. Subban, who actually goes around with a sewing machine affixed to the table in front of his bicycle. So I'm just trying to imagine this man cycling around and having an entire sewing machine, maybe a singer machine right in front there. And then there's this other lady who actually has a steam iron heated with a gas canister attached to the back of her bike. That's fascinating to know. So I'm curious to know what you yourself have used.
Okay, so for myself, actually, I've only ever had the instant coffee because so in central Jakarta, it's not as common to see some of these services like traveling tailors and such. So these typically cater to neighborhoods with a lot of residential areas. So to find them, you have to actually go out of your way a little bit. And while I was very tempted to try the steam ironing on wheels, because ironing is such a chore, but at the end of the day, they were just too far.
Right.
So I tried contacting a few actually, because nowadays a lot of people in Indonesia, they like using Instagram and TikTok to advertise their services. So I found their phone numbers and I just asked, will you be anywhere around this area?
Right.
And then they told me that they typically operate like in nearby towns, so they're not in Jakarta. So in the end, I couldn't meet up with them. So I had to basically just resort to ironing my own clothes, sadly.
Oh dear, poor thing.
Yeah. But it was quite eye-opening, I think. And if there were more services available in central Jakarta, I guess I would have been curious enough to try them. I spent, I believe, about an hour plus just sitting in this neighborhood in East Jakarta, because I was told that there was a traveling cobbler who would come around every day. So I was hoping to meet him, to ask him to help with my shoes. But in the end, he didn't show up. And then there's also a traveling handyman who does his route around South Jakarta. I found his phone number, but he was just very shy. Like the minute when I texted him to ask him, could I have a chat with you, maybe interview you or something? He just kept asking me, how do you get my number?
I see.
Yes.
Okay. So people who are interested in engaging the services of these people, they would generally get the numbers from, you were saying, Instagram, TikTok, and also, I guess, by word of mouth.
Yeah.
Do we have any sense of how many of these vendors there are in Jakarta, and maybe more broadly Indonesia itself?
Okay, so the thing is, the government doesn't actually keep track of how many people are part of this sector. So, for what the government does have is a breakdown of people in the formal sector and the informal sector. So, in the informal sector, they're characterized by people who are self-employed, for instance, or working without formal contracts. And as of August this year, it's roughly about 58% of the workforce
Right.
who work in this sector.
Right.
But there's no granular breakdown to tell us how many people are actually doing this, unfortunately.
I see. Anecdotally, do you have a sense whether the number of these vendors is growing, or is the appeal of doing such work increasing for Indonesians, and why?
So I think generally speaking, a lot of the people who are working in this field, they don't tend to be super young generally. So based on my observations, like just walking around town, a lot of them tend to be perhaps in their mid-30s to 40s, perhaps, some even older. And those of them who I've spoken to, they tell me that they started doing this since before COVID, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. Whereas those who transitioned after COVID-19, so they told me that the reason they did this is because either they lost their jobs or they were running businesses that just didn't see any footfall during the pandemic and because of lockdown. So to transition from that period, they decided perhaps bringing my service to customers would be a lot more useful in actually earning some money rather than remaining with a storefront that people weren't visiting.
Right. So you reckon that this trend probably spiked during the pandemic. But of course, as you noted, there have been these pre-colonial traditions in Indonesia where we do have peddlers who would go from village to village selling food and other items, right? Do you have a sense of how much these workers today can earn as compared to if they are part of the formal economy?
Okay. So I think that the sensing that I got from the people I've spoken to, I would take what they say with a pinch of salt, simply because, at the end of the day, they're self-reporting their income and we don't know for sure unless I were to go through their bank accounts. But generally speaking, most of them said that they were earning about 4.5 to 5 million rupiah in a month. So if they were working in a factory right now, the average monthly wage of a factory worker is about 3 million.
Okay.
So they're earning about roughly, I think if you convert it to Singapore dollars, it's about $80 to $160 more. Yeah.
Right. So that is quite an increase, right? So I guess it will be quite difficult for the government to try to persuade them to transition to proper jobs in the formal economy if basically the take-home pay from the latter is just not as high.
Yeah. And I think the other challenge actually is while the government can try to push for these people to try and get jobs in the formal economy, at the end of the day, the formal economy itself, it cannot produce enough jobs for these people. So I think the World Bank published a paper last year, actually, and they saw that in 2020, during COVID-19, the economy added only 1.9 million jobs, but there were 3.4 million people entering the workforce for the first time.
Right.
So there's always that disparity. And the World Bank report also shows that that disparity is still continuing till today. So there's a limit to the kinds of job opportunities that people, even with university degrees, are unable to access at this point in time, which makes the informal sector a very lucrative alternative because at this point, they really have not much choice.
And that's going to be quite a big challenge for the new president, of course, right? Mr. Prabowo Subianto has said that he wants to achieve this 8% economic growth. But of course, so in order to stimulate the economy, he needs to have government revenues. And this informal sector has been identified as a possibility where we could try to transition workers to a formal economy and then you grow a new revenue stream.
Yeah.
But if, like you said, the take-home pay is still going to be lower. And I guess the other upside for these vendors is that they do have flexibility in their work. It's going to be quite a hard sell for the government to try to get them to do so.
Yeah, it's going to be a hard sell for sure because on top of things like flexibility and the higher pay, I think that when you think of the formal sector, you also think about the sort of social protection, the sort of safety nets that exist for them.
Yes.
But when speaking to these workers, it's not exactly something that's of the utmost importance simply because if you want to talk about
top of mind for them, I guess, right?
Yeah, and if you want to talk about like medical coverage, for instance, the government recently also introduced like healthcare plans and everything to help Indonesians.
Mm.
And then if it's related to maybe work-related injury compensation, things like that, it's really not something that a lot of these people are thinking about.
Mm.
So for instance, even there's actually a sort of a village, I wouldn't call it a village per se, but a street where coffee vendors, the ones going on bicycles, they all live in the same space.
Mm.
So I found out about the address from one of the coffee vendors that I interviewed. And when I spoke to a few of them living there, they all said that they come from the island of Madura. And they said that they chose to come to Jakarta simply because there was the opportunity to earn more than to remain in their village where they would probably end up becoming farmers, for instance. So I think that while there's all sorts of safety nets, there are benefits definitely to getting formal employment. At the end of the day, the most practical need that people are looking towards at this point in time is really about how can they earn more in as short a time as possible
Right.
to improve their living standards. So with that in mind, with that consideration that they have, I would think that the informal sector will still remain popular.
Mm.
And even though Prabowo is saying that he plans to achieve higher economic growth over the years and stimulate the economy and things like that, it will be a big challenge if he were to tap on these informal workers simply because it's not just about trying to lure them in with greater benefits, but also trying to change their mindsets.
And you were saying that the age range for these vendors tend to be between the 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
What about the younger ones? Do you see younger Indonesians doing this as well?
There are younger Indonesians doing this, but they don't come from Jakarta. So they come from other islands, they come from other parts that are poorer, and they come here in the hopes of earning more, even though it's hard labor still. They did tell me that it's better than being a farmer in their village where, your crop yield for the year is dependent on the weather and things like that, and whether you can actually sell at the market and stuff. So for them working in Jakarta, even though they have to work 7 days a week and cycle for many, many kilometers every single day just to get customers, they still think it's more worthwhile because the amount that they earn here when they send back, perhaps on average, a lot of them said they send back about 500,000 rupiah to their families.
Right.
So that's about 40 Sing dollars. And that amount already, they said, is quite substantial compared to the meager earnings that they would have as a farmer.
Right. So we've been talking about the vendors so far, but what about the customers? What is the allure of such services for those who avail themselves of such activities?
I think for customers, it's largely about convenience and the fact that these services are very cheap. So for the coffee vendors, actually, I've noticed that they're very strategic in how they go about their routes. They make sure that they stop outside of offices, they stop outside of schools. Because selling a cup of coffee for 5,000 rupiah, that's about 42 Singapore cents, that is way below the cost of a cup of coffee at Starbucks or Kopi Kenangan. And because of that, because of how cheap it is, they're able to maximize their customer base by going to places where people need their coffee fix, but they're not willing to spend as much to get coffee. So I would say that cost is definitely a big factor. Even to get your clothes repaired at a mobile tailor, I believe the cost of the sewing, the most expensive holes to repair, the most expensive adjustments to make, it will only cost you about 40,000 rupiah. So that is less than $4, basically.
Right.
So it's very cheap compared to going to a proper shop, basically. So that's one reason. And the other reason I would think is really because of convenience. So a lot of people who I've spoken to, they told me that they've come to depend on these mobile vendors because they know that these vendors will actually stop outside their house and they don't have to worry about making a commute. They don't have to worry about lugging a lot of laundry over or anything.
Right.
They can just wait outside the house. They see the guy coming and they're like, hi, can you please fix this? Can you please iron all these? And I guess with the advent of technology nowadays as well, a lot of these vendors also share their phone numbers so that they can be contacted through WhatsApp. So it's sort of like having personal services on demand. Yeah. And
at your doorstep,
exactly.
which I think is the biggest allure.
Yeah. And so it becomes a whole community event in that sense. So I remember when in North Jakarta, when I met Mr. Subban, there was a long line of women just waiting for him to finish sewing. And all of them were just chit-chatting with one another, talking about their plans of the weekend while they were waiting for him to sew. And when I spoke to them as well, they told me that it's become sort of a tradition in that part of the neighborhood where when he comes, all the housewives will just come out of their houses, whether or not you have laundry to sew, whether or not you have any clothes that need repairing, they'll just come out and chit-chat with one another. Yeah.
So it's almost become a community hub of its own. Yeah. Okay, well, so Aqil, you've been in Indonesia for 3 months now. You're one of our young reporters who've been sent out to a foreign bureau for a short stint. Tell me, how has the experience been like for you so far?
I would say that it's been very eye-opening, simply because, for starters, I've never been to Jakarta before, so I didn't really know what to expect. And I must say that the experience has been rather wild. I think in my first week, not even 3 days in, I was already covering a protest happening outside the parliament because of proposed transition laws by the former president, Joko Widodo. So people were just protesting, and then things became a lot more intense when people were flinging Molotov cocktails and everything. And it just made me realize that people here take their democracy very seriously. Like, they take the right to vote, they take the right to have a say in political decisions very, very seriously. So I was speaking to students who had traveled from nearby towns and everything. They actually took train rides that were about 2 hours long just to be able to protest outside the Parliament House. And I remember asking them, like, why would you travel all the way just to protest when your leaders aren't even inside to listen to you? And they said that it's not just about making sure that their politicians are listening to them, but it's also to send a sign that the young people living in Indonesia, they will not just sit back and watch leaders do whatever they want. They wanted to make their voices heard, and even if the leaders weren't there, they were hoping that just by showing up, perhaps even having some media covering them, that would be enough to show that young people in Indonesia are taking this very seriously. And I thought that was something very admirable. Yeah, it was really just eye-opening. It was really nice to see people actually take their politics very seriously, because I think it's something that I've not really been exposed to before. So to see young people talk about the reasons why they were doing this, why it's important to uphold democracy, things like that, it was very enlightening to me.
Right, and you also wrote this really memorable piece where you went to an Islamic boarding school that used to be a recruitment ground for the now defunct terror group JI.
Yeah.
What was that like for you?
Okay, I remember that very well because everywhere I went somehow, I don't know why, but people from the school, like the imams and everything, the first thing they would ask me is, "Are you married?" And then when I told them, "No, I'm not," they would ask me, "Do you want to get married? I have a daughter," or something like that. Yeah, so that one was a bit of a shock. Then I just get very stunned and I'll be like, "Huh?" Yeah. But
so did you meet anyone?
No, I didn't. Although in the second school that we went, after the evening prayers, the principal of the school did ask me if I wanted to meet some of the students who were women.
Right.
And I just told him that, "Oh no, it's a bit late now. We should quickly finish our interview and, stop bothering you all." Yeah.
I see. Well, I mean, that's quite curious to me. Why this, desire on their part to want to sort of connect you with the young, eligible women there?
Okay, this is purely my theory. I have no idea if it's true or not, but I think it was also because when I introduced myself to them, I said that, "Oh, I'm from Singapore." And that immediately made all of them start giving looks like, "Oh, this guy's from Singapore," and things like that. And then they start talking amongst themselves, and that's when the marriage proposals came. So I'm not sure if it's, to them, they see it as a sort of way for their daughters or something, for a better future, to secure a better future, for instance. Yeah.
I see. So for the benefit of our readers, can you tell me how old you are?
I'm 27.
I see. A very eligible young bachelor.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Aqil, for joining us on the show. I'm glad you have had a good time, and I look forward to seeing you back in Singapore.
I don't want to go back if I can. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, the thing is, food here is very cheap, and I am not ready to go back to expensive hawker center food.
Right, I see. Okay, well, we will need to have another discussion on that. Thank you so much again, Aqil.
Thank you.
Well, that's a wrap for Asian Insider. If you would like to read our column, we have a link in our podcast show notes. This episode was produced and edited by Faisal Sani. Thank you for listening.
send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.